while I generally agree that the photographer and not the camera creates the picture, there are still some tools that are quite handy and sometimes can make a different kind of a special effect in photography. And today I want to cover the most important tools, at least from my perspective, for landscape photography, because there are a lot of options available. And I think if you're on a budget, you don't want to spend too much money, but you also don't want to miss out on the important ones. So I just want to cover the ones that I think are really essential and the ones that are nice to have, and maybe also mention one or two that I think I would rather not buy because they might just end up somewhere in the closet collecting dust. Let's start with the most obvious piece of equipment, and that's the camera. And here I think many people give too much importance to the camera. If you want to print in this size or even a bit bigger, like let's say up to 1 meter, I have printed like this and even bigger before with pictures that had 20 megapixels. So, and in landscape photography, you usually don't need to crop. So unless you really print 3, 4, 5 meters wide, there is, in my opinion, no need for a 45 or 60 megapixel camera. Instead, you can save some money here, but I would make sure that you have a camera that has a decent to good dynamic range. And depending on what conditions you are usually shooting, I would also get one that is more or less protected against at least some water, some sand, and so on. Far more important than the camera is definitely the lens, because this gives the image kind of its character. And if I could only choose one lens for landscape photography, I would probably go with a 24-105 or something. It's a good starting point, a good all-rounder, but in my opinion, it's sometimes just not as wide as I would like it to be. So I actually use my 16-35 for the lower end. I rarely have the feeling that I need to go wider than 16 millimeters. And until 35 it's a nice range. I wish it would be until 50 millimeters or something, but that's it, where a second lens is coming in. This would be like something like a 70-200 or 100-500, just something to take some more close-ups of some peaks in the background of mountains or of some trees that are in the fog or whatever. So I think this is, like, for me at least, the ideal setup. Not too heavy, not too expensive, but I still have quite a range. So 116-35 or similar, and then 170-200 or 100-400, something like this. The good news is that for landscape photography you often don't need to buy the most expensive glass. So first of all, you don't need fast glass. You don't need an f2.8 or something if you just take the average landscape shot. This is an f4, so it's already much cheaper and much lighter than an f2.8. But to be honest, I use it mostly between f8 and f14, which also means I do care a lot about sharpness of my glass. But for this one, I care about the sharpness let's say f8 to f11, something like this. And at f8 it's not perfect, but at f11 it's really sharp until the edges. At f4 it's not performing the best, but I really don't shoot landscapes at f4, so I don't care. So what I want to say is you can save quite some money there, and also some weight. For example, the 70-200, the 2.8 version is much more expensive, much heavier than the f4. Often you don't need image stabilization. This depends a bit on your type of shooting, and also the autofocus doesn't need to be the best one. You can even have a lens that is manual focus. What I would still check is, like I said, the overall sharpness, at least if you stop down a bit, and you can check the sharpness of the lens at different apertures at some websites like the Digital Picture or dxomark.com or more. And otherwise, what I would look, if you shoot a lot of backlit, like sunset, sunrise, a lens that has a nice sun star with these sunbeams, this is very nice. Unfortunately, you cannot read this from the specs of the lens, but here I would just check for reviews of other photographers. One aspect is also how much flare is the lens producing. So let's move to the next thing, which would be the tripod. So what should you get here? Again, it completely depends on your budget. If you don't want to spend too much money, I think aluminum is a very good option. It's not too heavy, but it's much more affordable than the carbon fiber I have here. And for the tripod head, I would usually go with a ball head. I have a flex shooter here, which is kind of a special ball head, and it's a bit bigger, but this is because it should also support my 600mm lens. And I think this brings me to an important point. Think a bit before about what you want to do with the tripod and with the tripod head. So again, as we just said before, if you have a 16-35 and a 70-200, then make sure that the tripod head is stable enough for the 70-200 as well. I would go to a camera shop where you can quickly test the tripod, just mount your camera, go to the 200mm or the most focal length you have, and then try like a bit a longer shutter speed. So from my experience, something between 1/10 of a second to half a second. This is a very critical shutter speed window. If it still produces sharp images in these situations, I think you're good to go. So I would not buy something that is unnecessarily heavy, but I had it in workshops that I was teaching that participants had a tripod or a tripod head that was like too cheap and too light, and it just didn't produce any sharp images, which was a bit of a pity. This probably goes without saying, but most of the tripod heads come with some kind of mounting system. Arca Swiss is a very famous one, so you will need a plate that goes to your camera. And this is like the more basic version, very cheap, or I should say inexpensive maybe. It works. The problem is just if you shoot vertically, it gets a bit more annoying. And here is where L brackets are really nice. You can see one here. And the way they work is basically you mount your camera on the L bracket, and then you can like put it in a vertical position and mount it like that on the tripod head. I know that there are some workarounds, like also with a normal base plate. Most of the ball heads have an option where you can like tilt it by 90 degrees, but I found it a bit, well, not so satisfying, so it's okay. I only have an L bracket for one of my cameras. If by accident I have the wrong camera with me because I wasn't anticipating landscape shots, it works. But if you do a lot of landscape photography, I would invest in one. They're around 110, 140 bucks. There are different versions of L brackets. They're the ones that are specific for one camera model. So they are usually a bit lighter, and they have the advantage that you can get very easily to all the connectors and everything. On the other side, of course, if you upgrade your camera, you will need a new L bracket. There are also universal ones. They're just a bit bulkier and heavier. You need to decide what's best for you. Next up, there are filters, and if you can only afford one filter, I would definitely go for a polarizing filter, a circular polarizing filter. What this is doing is basically just reducing the glare or the reflections in different surfaces that are non-metallic. So this can be rocks, water, leaves, and so on. And in general, it just increases the saturation also of the sky. It gets a bit darker and more bluish. And it can also be nice if you shoot, let's say, a nice landscape with a lake. You can kind of see the rocks in the lake in the foreground a bit, so you see a bit through the water, which is a really nice effect, and it's by far the most used filter that I have. The second filter I would get if you can spend some more money is a neutral density filter. This one is like taking 3 stops of light. So basically this is if you have a certain aperture and a certain ISO. Let's say you are already with the lowest ISO that you can do, and the aperture you don't want to close more for whatever reason, and you want to take pictures of a river that is going down, and you want to see this flow of the river a bit more, but you're at 125th of a second. Well, if you take this one, you can go at least to a 15th of a second. So there you start seeing a bit the flow of the river. And as I said, they come in different strengths. So I also have a second one that is much stronger. I would maybe start with one of the filters if you don't have a lot of money available. Otherwise, also buy a second one, a stronger one. Can be really nicely used. I mean, I never use it for rivers actually, but it can be really nice if you want to make the clouds in the sky move and really take a picture, expose for like 2, 3, 4, up to 10 minutes, and then you have this special effect. The polarizing filter is a bit more difficult to construct, and here I would also spend a bit more money. I once bought one for I think 30 bucks, and it was good with my 16-35, or good enough. With my 70-200 on the other hand, it produced just blurry results, that it was a pity, and then I bought a more expensive one, I think around 100 bucks. For the neutral density filter, here I bought a bit cheaper one, around 40 bucks. This was still good enough. I will try to to link as much of the equipment that I'm showing here also in the video description. These will be affiliate links, so if you buy them, I get a small provision for it. There are also these so-called slim versions. They are quite thin, so the advantage is if you use like 2 filters or 3 behind, you are less likely to get a vignetting with a wide-angle lens. Finally, the last filter that I sometimes use is a graded neutral density filter. As you can see, it's like on top it's dark like a neutral density filter, it's gray, and on the bottom it's transparent. So this is nice if you want to take pictures of sunsets or other situations where the sky is kind of bright and the foreground is kind of dark, so you have a high dynamic range. You put this one and the sky gets a bit darker. You can move it to the position where you have the sky. So these are filters that I would really recommend in this square format that you can move and not as screw-on filters. You might already know or think this doesn't work well if you have some kind of a valley as the horizon or a peak of a mountain or something. It works best if the horizon is more or less flat. And there's also 2 or 3 different versions actually. Like this is a soft gradient, there is a strong hard gradient, and sometimes there is even these reverse filters. I just use the soft one and I'm quite fine with it, but I need to say I use it less often than, let's say, 8 years ago, just because the dynamic range of the cameras has gotten so much better that sometimes I even don't think about bringing it or something, and I just adjust this a bit in post. But if I have it with me, if I have the time, if I really do landscape photography, I still enjoy using them, because it's just, for me at least, nicer to already on the back of the screen see how the picture should look like, and not like needing to imagine, oh, but I need to darken the sky a bit in post, or I need to lift the shadows. Something I completely stopped using is a remote trigger. Like I had the one that was attached with a cable to the camera. I have to say, I mean, the idea is that you don't cause vibration when you take pictures. What I usually do nowadays is just put a 2-second timer. This works quite well. I could also connect my phone and then use the phone as a trigger. Works also quite well, even though it takes a bit longer, of course, to connect this than to just plug a cable. But the thing was, I always find it a bit annoying if the the camera is already on the tripod and I realize, oh, I need to put the remote trigger, the cable release. Yeah, I don't know, and sometimes I also forgot it at home, so I stopped using it. If you are already using it, you like it, of course, go ahead. If you're a complete beginner, I think this is not something I would invest money as of now. I think these are the most important tools for beginner and a bit advanced landscape photographers. There are some things I didn't mention that are kind of obvious that you need to use them. For example, like a lens wipe for cleaning the lenses from time to time, or this small dust blower, something like this. I would also highly recommend to use the lens hood that is hopefully included with your lens. Of course, you need a SD or CF Express card, but actually here for landscape photography you don't need a super fast one. I would always recommend to have at least one spare battery with you, because photography with live view drains your battery quite quickly, and especially if you're taking pictures when you're in a cold environment, so with the temperatures below 0 degrees Celsius, so that's the freezing point for you using Fahrenheit. The battery drains really quickly, and there it really helps if you keep one as close to the body as possible, so an inner pocket of the jacket or something. Is there something that I forgot to mention? Then please let me know in the comments, and also let me know if you want other video about something similar than this, but more for macro photography, for bird photography, or maybe about some equipment that I showed here quickly, if you want a bit more information about this.